The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, hello everybody.
It's nice to be back in this studio again, isn't it?
It always is.
Especially after a long weekend.
It didn't feel like a long weekend.
It didn't to you?
No, it went by very fast.
Well, I thought it was. I had the long drive. Well, I drove, but we had the long drive of going to Lake Placid this weekend.
That's true.
We hit some shops.
We did.
Went to see my daughter's piece of art in the art exhibit.
We did.
And it was fantastic because she got first place out of all the schools in the area.
She did. It was very exciting. It was very, very cool to see her portrait up there on the wall.
And we hit some cool little shops down the strip. Although it was pouring rain.
And very cold.
That it was. Raining here, but snowing there.
Yes. Although the perpetual mound of snow that's always there, like 365 days a year, I don't know if you noticed, there was no snow there this time.
Right.
Yeah, which I thought was funny, because even in the summer, they have a huge pile of snow there.
So with all that said, we're skipping the housekeeping tonight. And I know that Beth is excited to share her story tonight.
I am. I'm always excited.
That you are.
But I'm doubly excited tonight.
It's a good one, isn't it?
I guess. Of course it is.
I took a peek at it when you weren't looking.
How nice of you.
Yeah. A little naughty.
Well, my story is not naughty. It's actually very sad. Because poor Maud Plunkett has been angry for a very long time. Married to her one true love and widowed all on the same day, she eventually married 2 more times, with her third marriage tying her to a man she didn't really get along with. The problem is, Maud and her first and third husbands are still essentially living together, even though they may not even know it. But visitors and staff at Malahide Castle, just 9 miles north of Dublin, Ireland, certainly do know it, because they've encountered the 3 unhappy spirits for decades. Often called the most haunted castle in Ireland, which that's saying a lot.
Yeah, it really is. When you think about all the castles in Ireland.
That's quite the title.
That's a big deal.
Yeah. The 12th century home and fortification has an interesting history, just like you'd expect it to, especially when you consider that it remained in one family for almost 800 years. And Maud and her 2 former husbands aren't the only ghosts who make themselves known at Malahide Castle. Residents, visitors, and guests can attest to at least 3 more, including the specter of an unknown woman, a regicide, and a former court jester named Puck. So, to begin with, today, Malahide Castle is a 260-acre parkland sitting, as I said, 9 miles north of Dublin. The exterior of the castle looks exactly as you'd imagine an Irish castle should look. It's pale gray stone, thick round towers, and small arched windows. It kind of looks like something you could build out of Lego because it's that compact, and yet it's totally imposing at the same time. On the inside, there's a great hall with an arched ceiling and dozens of portraits lining the walls, including pieces on loan from the National Gallery of Ireland. Each room in the castle is decorated in lavish antique furniture, and the coolest room, in my humble opinion, is the oak room, with its floor-to-ceiling carved oak panels burnished a deep chocolate brown and a 5-paneled arched glass window. Although a timber structure and an earlier stone structure stood where the castle does now, it wasn't until 1185 that the existing castle's construction began. So, it's a baby castle. It's only been around since 1185.
Only.
11 years earlier, a knight by the name of Richard Talbot accompanied King Henry II to Ireland. King Henry decided to give, quote, the lands and harbor of Malahide to Talbot, and for the next 791 years, the Talbots owned and added on to the castle. Now, there was a period from 1649 to 1660 when the Talbots were unceremoniously removed from their home, but I'll get to that in a little bit. In the early 1400s, the Baron of Killeen's daughter, Lady Matilda Plunkett, fell madly in love with one of Talbot's soldiers, named Walter Hussey Lord Galtrim. Because Lord Galtrim was in service to Talbot, his father asked for permission for the young couple to be wed at Malahide. Talbot agreed, and the two young lovers were set to marry on Whit Monday, 1429. Now, Whit Monday is a Christian holiday that marks the descent of the Holy Spirit onto Jesus' disciples. Matilda, who went by Maud, and Lord Galtrim's wedding day did not end well. There are two versions of how things transpired. The first version is that Lord Galtrim was ambushed and stabbed to death by his rival on his way to the wedding. The other version is that Maud and Lord Galtrim did marry, but within hours he rode out to the battlefield and was carried home on his shield, a victim of his mortal wounds. Regardless of exactly how he died, Lord Galtrim still allegedly wanders the halls of Malahide Castle searching for Maud, his bride. Those who have seen him say he appears briefly and gestures over and over for people to acknowledge the spear wound in his side. Quite often, people hear him moaning as well, although whether that's due to his wound or his broken heart, no one can say. The ghost of Lord Galtrim is always seen alone. He never seems to be able to find his one true love, and perhaps that's because Maud may not have been so heartbroken over his untimely death. She allegedly married husband number 2 quite quickly, and he was rumored to have been the man who murdered Lord Galtrim. Maud and husband number 2 also weren't married for very long, and Maud married for a third time to Sir Richard Talbot in 1440. Now, obviously that wasn't the original Richard Talbot. The family did what a lot of aristocratic families did and named several of their descendants the same name. But here's where the narrative gets a little tricky, because most of the accounts that I read said that Maud was married 3 times. First to the murdered Lord Galtrim, then to an unnamed husband number 2, and then to an unnamed husband number 3, referenced only as a Chief Lord Justice. And despite searching for quite a while, I couldn't figure out if Richard Talbot was husband number 2 or if he was husband number 3, the Lord Chief Justice, because they didn't really name them in the sources. But by all accounts, her third marriage to this Lord Chief Justice was not a happy one. The two argued constantly, to the point that Maud allegedly chased the man around the house, screaming at him and berating him as he moved from room to room trying to get away from her. She picked fights constantly, according to the servants, and the Lord Chief Justice was repeatedly trying to find some solace behind locked doors. I can just picture her chasing him around.
She sounds like a piece of work.
There are church ruins adjoining the castle where Maud was laid to rest after her death. The tomb includes a carved effigy of Maud laying across the top, and the following epitaph, quote, "She was the daughter of a Baron Plunket of Colleen, and in early life had been betrothed to the young Lord of Galtrim. Upon the day of celebrating the nuptials and at the delivery of the last words of the solemn contract, the bridegroom was called away from the altar steps to head his followers and scatter a gathering of the Irish. O vanity of earthly hopes! In a few short hours he was borne homewards to his widowed bride, stretched on his shield like the steel-girt slain by moonlight seen on the battle plain." That's a long epitaph.
It's quite nice, though.
It's very lovely, although it's sad. But it's quite long.
Well, think of the life he would have had if he stayed married to her.
Well, right. Unless he really was her one true love, she would have been chasing him around the castle too, yelling at him.
Yeah, I got the feeling.
She was a yeller?
Yes, dear. She was a screamer.
So it seems Maud did marry a Talbot at one point, and she did live at Malahide Castle. And as I alluded to in the beginning of my story, she haunts it as well. However, she's still as unhappy in the afterlife as she was during her third marriage. People who have seen her ghost claim that she is dressed in her wedding gown and seems to run down the halls chasing a male spirit, who many believe is the Lord Chief Justice, husband number 3. So, yeah, the Lord Chief Justice has also stuck around. And when the poor man isn't being chased through the halls of the castle by his eternally angry wife, his apparition has been seen jogging around the castle grounds or performing what looks like weightlifting exercises.
That's interesting. Now, why can't they all just get along like the ghosts do on the sitcom Ghost?
Well, I was thinking about that show while I was researching this because it does remind me of some of the characters on that show, especially the British version of the show.
The British version is so much better
than the American version.
Yes,
yeah,
by far.
Yeah. But I'm thinking that they're on different, planes of existence or whatever. I mean, Maud and husband number 3 certainly know of each other's existence in the castle. But if Lord Galtrim is still wandering around looking for her, as people say he is, then he probably doesn't know that she's there.
It could very well be.
And he probably would be happier not knowing because
he's better off.
She might chase him around too. So during Henry VIII's reign in the 1500s, there was a dwarf at Malahide Castle known as Puck. He apparently lived in one of the castle's towers and doubled as both a night watchman and the court jester. Puck was often surrounded by the aristocratic elite, and at some point he fell madly in love with a young woman who was either a relative of Lady Eleanora Fitzgerald or Lady Eleanora herself, because, again, accounts differ as far as who exactly it was. Lady Eleanora was related to the Talbots, and Puck's love interest was being hidden away at Malahide because she had a bit of a rebellious streak. Just like Lord Galtrim's exact cause of death, Puck's is also up for debate. Some stories say that when the Talbots found out about his affection for his high-born lady, they immediately demanded that he get over it. He couldn't, of course, and spent several days in heartbroken misery. When the young lady herself rejected him, It was too much for him to bear, and he took his own life. Other stories say that he was in charge of guarding this trouble-causing young lady's door to ensure that she didn't run around at night plotting against the king. One night, he allowed himself to be distracted or tricked, and she did escape her room during his watch. Puck was so ashamed that he hung himself. But the most popular version of Puck's demise is that on a snowy December evening, he was found outside the castle walls in his jester's costume, succumbing to fatal stab wounds. As they carried him back inside, Puck cursed the castle with his dying breath, saying that he would haunt it for all eternity until he hunted down his murderer. He promised that his ghost would not hurt anyone as long as a male member of the Talbot family always lived in the castle. Puck's ghost is often captured in photographs, or at least he tends to be the one spirit who likes to show himself in photos. Guests to Malahide Castle's turret, where Puck allegedly lived, have taken pictures of what appeared to be an empty room, only to notice the strange anomaly of a man in a jester's costume in their pictures when they look at them later. Puck's other tricks are just as mischievous. He tends to move objects and slam doors. The Talbot family claims Puck made an appearance as recently as 1976, when Rose Talbot ceded the castle to the Irish state due to her inability to pay the inheritance taxes, and a good portion of the family belongings had to be sold. He appeared in photographs most often during this time of change, and coincidentally, when the last male Talbot left Malahide. Just like he said in his curse.
Right.
Yeah. In 1640, John Talbot stayed away from the rebellion that was sweeping the countryside. However, his decision not to get involved meant that he was indicted for treason, and Malahide Castle was taken away from the Talbot family. In 1649, the chief baron of Ireland, Miles Corbett, leased the castle for £50 a year. He said he brought his family to Malahide in order to escape the plague that was sweeping through Dublin. But Corbett was one of the 59 regicides, men who plotted the death of King Charles I. When King Charles was overthrown, Oliver Cromwell thanked the regicides in various ways, and some sources say Cromwell thanked Corbett by giving him Malahide Castle. Now, Corbett was not well liked by the locals, especially when he tried to outlaw Catholicism, and he attacked the local abbey. Eventually, when Cromwell was executed and Charles II became king, Corbett fled Ireland to the Netherlands in fear of his life. This was around 1662, and the Talbot family was able to return to Malahide Castle. When Corbett was caught, he was brought back to Malahide Castle, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Now, for those of you who aren't knowledgeable in the language of medieval execution, which I also was not.
Really?
Well, I was curious what drawn and quartered meant. Like, I kind of thought I knew, but I looked it up just in case.
I learned that in the 4th grade.
What teacher taught you that in the 4th grade?
What do you mean, what teacher?
You just looked it up yourself?
We were talking about history.
That's back when school was cool, I guess.
School was cool back then.
School is still cool.
Well, hey, we weren't. They didn't take it easy on us.
Okay, well, for those of you who are listening that are a little bit younger than Wes here, and you didn't learn what drawn and quartered meant in school, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, it says that drawn and quartered meant that a person was hanged, but not to the point of death. Then they were drawn or disemboweled. Did Did you know that drawn meant disemboweled?
Yep.
Well, of course you're going to say, yep. That was a dumb question for me to ask. Their entrails would then be burned in front of them before they were beheaded. Then they would be quartered or divided into 4 pieces.
Right. What they would do is they would take ropes and tie it to all 4 extremities.
And tie it to horses, right?
Tie it to horses. And then they would just slowly pull them apart.
I knew that part.
It was quite disturbing.
And yet you seem so happy to be telling me this.
Well, you know that I'm fascinated by medieval torture.
That's great, honey.
No. If you look at some of the devices that they used back then, they were brilliant.
Brilliant or brutal?
Well,
or both?
Well, they were quite brilliant.
Brilliantly brutal.
Right.
Yes. I knew the quartered part. I guess I didn't know what drawn meant. I didn't know that was the whole disembowelment thing.
I mean, if you go back and look, some of the apparatuses that they used were just ingenious. They put a lot of effort into those.
They did put a lot of thought into them, yes.
Some craftsmanship. Made you think twice about committing crimes.
You're making me think twice about sharing the same bed with you when I sleep.
We're talking about medieval times.
Right. Anyway, getting back to my story. Miles Corbett's ghost is also said to haunt Malahide Castle. He appears at all different times throughout the year, but most consistently on the anniversary of his death. When people see his apparition, he is fully clothed in knight's armor, but his ghost appears to fall to the ground in 4 separate pieces. After the death of Miles Corbett and the reinstating of the Talbot family, which, keep in mind, were British aristocracy, things at Malahide Castle didn't exactly calm down. In 1690, 14 members of the Talbot family all fought in the Battle of the Boyne, which was between the Jacobites, who were still local to the deposed King James II, against those who were loyal to the recently appointed Prince William and Mary II. The Talbot men fought on the side of King James, and by that evening, 13 out of the 14 had died on the battlefield, which made me think of Game of Thrones. I don't know why, but it just did. Even though they were considered on the, quote, wrong side by Prince William, the Talbots did not lose their castle or their land. Then, in April of 1973, so we're jumping quite a bit, 300 years there. In April of 1973, the 7th and final Baron of Malahide, Milo John Reginald Talbot, passed away. He was an accomplished botanist and horticulturist, as well as a diplomat. Malahide Castle was then passed down to the Baron's sister, Rose Maud Talbot. Unable to afford the inheritance taxes and death duties, Rose ended up giving the castle and grounds to the Irish state, which ironically was what her brother wanted to have happen anyway. The Baron's gardens and greenhouses still exist today, lovingly restored and conserved. But this brings us to our final 3 spirits said to haunt Malahide Castle. Amongst the portraits in the Great Hall that I had described earlier is apparently one of a young lady in a white dress. She's not a member of the Talbot family, as far as anyone can tell, and no one knows what her name was or how she's connected to the castle or if she even is, because no one's really sure how her portrait even came to be there. Now, to be honest, I tried a couple times with various keywords to see if I could find a photo online of this portrait, because I wanted to at least try to figure out what time period she was from based on the style of her dress, but I couldn't find anything. So, unfortunately, I can't give any of you a description of what she looked like or even what era she might be from. And you're probably wondering, well, why are you even telling us about her then? And it's because her portrait could very well be a haunted object. Because visitors and people who work at the castle have sworn that at night her apparition actually emerges from the painting and then wanders all through the castle and on the grounds. And since there's no known history to go with the lady in white, people aren't sure if she lived at the castle or if her spirit was brought there with this portrait. And last but not least, there are two gray-haired old ladies. Only seen out on the castle grounds, this pair of sad and disheartened-looking women are believed to be Danish ladies who were cast off the property by the Talbot family hundreds of years ago. Any of the inside ghosts, from Puck to Maud to the Lord Chief Justice to Miles Corbett, could be responsible for the strange things that happen at Malahide Castle. The staff don't really have any other explanation for the locked doors that sometimes open by themselves, or the open doors that slam shut for no apparent reason. They can't explain why some of the water faucets turn on by themselves either, or why they sometimes feel unseen hands push them in the lower back as they walk down empty hallways.
Sounds like the dwarf.
Yes, well, they think a lot of it is Puck, because he's very mischievous and likes to play jokes.
It makes sense.
Now, Malahide Castle doesn't offer specific ghost tours, but they don't shy away from their ghostly residents either, because they do mention them on their website. They have a whole page about the various ghosts there. And that's my story.
That's it? You ended it that abruptly? That's my story? You couldn't put in some extra effort?
I'm sorry. I got to the end and then I was like, oh, hey, look, that's the end.
Wow. Instead of a happy ending, it was a sad ending.
It was an abrupt ending.
Well,
there's a lot of ghosts.
I enjoyed it.
Well, that's good. That's good. And there's a lot of ghosts there, and they're cool. And I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds of years of history that I didn't go into either, but they don't seem to tie directly to the ghosts, so I figured I would let people read about it on their own if they wanted to know the other hundreds of years worth of history of the castle, because it was involved in a lot of different battles.
Well, I can imagine. You know what I think sucks is that, can you imagine your family's been in a castle for 800 years and then, you get to modern day times and, well, you can't afford it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And either you sell off some parcels of land or you open it up as a museum part-time, perhaps give tours, or even quite possibly look for, movie
producers or whatever that want to film there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I had told you once, I had a friend in high school, and his family was from Ireland. I always thought it was cool that his mother still spoke Gaelic. But his family, when we were in high school, were selling off their castle that they'd had for like 600 years.
It's just sad.
Yeah.
It really is. Because who can afford a castle anymore? But with all that history there of your family,
mm-hmm.
It's not like here, you've lived in a house for 80 years and then, well,
right.
There goes your family history.
Right.
This is 800 years gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, not gone, because you've got, historians and people that are.
Right. I understand that. It's being maintained.
Right.
But to live inside the walls that your family has lived in for 800 years, that's just got to be comforting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A little bit jelly.
See, that's a little bit better ending than your just abrupt ending.
Me trying to sound hip and cool like the kids.
You're hip and cool, dear.
Aw, thanks.
And we'll be right back after this short break.
Hey, did you know? In Otsuchi Iwate Prefecture in Japan, there is a lovely white glass-pane phone booth in the middle of a garden called the Wind Phone. Inside the booth sits a notebook on a metal shelf and a black rotary-style phone. Users of the phone can slip inside the booth, pick up the completely unconnected receiver, and speak to their dead loved ones. Erected in 2010 by garden designer Itaro Sasaki as a way to help him deal with the death of his cousin, he said, quote, "Because my thoughts couldn't be relayed over a regular phone line, I wanted them to be carried on the wind." The Wind Phone has since received over 30,000 visitors. It is so popular and so lovely that similar phone booths have been erected in other parts of the world. Who'da thunk it? All right, we're back. And my dear, what are you going to tell us about this evening?
Tonight, I'm talking about the Mogollon Rim, otherwise known as Arizona's backbone, which is a 200-mile-long escarpment that rises 8,000 feet above sea level in some parts. It stretches diagonally across the state of Arizona, beginning outside the city of Flagstaff, all the way to the New Mexico border. The rim marks where the Colorado Plateau drops down to the White Mountain Range, to the Sonoran Desert. All along the spectacular rim are popular spots for hikers, campers, leaf peepers, and skiers. If you want to see the ponderosa pines and beautiful lakes, it's the place to go. And I have to say, the rim communities have some pretty cool names, like the city of Sedona, Pine Strawberry, Show Low, and Pine Top Lakeside. There is ample evidence that people hunted along the rim as far back as 10,000 years ago. But the first permanent communities, known as the Ancient People, first settled there in 600 AD. They thrived along the rim until 1350, living in both pueblos and cliffs. Sometime around 1350, the Ancient People left, most likely due to drought, and the Yavapai and the Tonto Apaches moved in. They coexisted pretty much undisturbed until the 1850s, when white fur trappers and gold prospectors started showing up in droves. Then in February of 1863, the Arizona Territory became even more popular with gold-seeking settlers and cattle ranchers. The Apaches defended their land by raiding their herds. This, of course, didn't sit very well with the U.S. government, and they established military posts all around the rim, setting off the Apache Wars. By the 1870s, the Yavapai and Apache were moved off their land and resettled on reservations. The first rim town, Payson, was officially deemed a town in 1884 when it earned a post office. But by the 1900s, the land was heavily depleted by ranching, and in an effort to conserve at least some of the land, the Tonto National Forest was established in 1907. Just an interesting little side note, the first paved road through Rim Country wasn't put in until 1958.
Wow, that's late.
It is. Anyway, the Mogollon Rim has been a very popular spot for people who love the great outdoors, and it also has seen some devastating wildfires. In 2002, the rim lost 470,000 acres to fire, surpassing the 300,000 acres that were lost in June of 1990.
Shit. That's a lot.
It is. So now that you know a little bit about the rim itself, I want to talk about the paranormal stuff that goes on there. And it runs the gamut for sure. First, you'd probably expect that with all the dense forest and high peaks, that the rim would most definitely have a Bigfoot population. And it supposedly does. But the first recorded Bigfoot sighting in Arizona actually took place further north at the Grand Canyon. It was in 1903, and a tourist named I.W. Stephen was written up in the Arizona Republican as seeing a, quote, wild man of the rocks. He reportedly described it as being a, quote, humanoid creature with long white hair and a matted beard that reached to its knees. It also had thin talon-like fingers that ended in claws that were at least 2 inches long. So it seems more than plausible that Bigfoot would move on from the busy Grand Canyon to quieter forest. And affectionately called the Mogollon Monster, this Bigfoot has been seen for decades. According to azcentral.com, the Mogollon Monster has ape-like features and walks on 2 feet, leaving footprints that are said to measure up to 22 inches long. It's said to be 7 to 10 feet tall and has a muscular body that's covered in shaggy brown or reddish hair, and it smells really, really bad, like a mixture of dead fish, skunk, human body odor, and decaying peat moss.
That's quite the combination.
It is.
I've never heard it described quite like that.
Not quite like that. Not like decaying peat moss.
No.
In his book, Weird Arizona, author Wesley Treat says that most people notice an eerie silence in the woods before the silence is broken by either a piercing scream, hair-raising howls, or deep growls. So it sounds pretty much like the descriptions of Bigfoot all over the U.S. One of the earliest encounters Treat writes about in his book occurred in the 1940s. It involved cryptozoologist Don Davis. When Davis was 13, he was on a Boy Scouts camping trip. He said, quote, "There, standing less than 4 feet in front of me, was a monster-like man. The creature was huge. Its eyes were deep-set and hard to see, but they seemed expressionless. His chest, shoulders, and arms were massive, especially the upper arms, easily upwards of 6 inches in diameter, perhaps much, much more." So, of course, I had to look at the Bigfoot Research Organization website, otherwise known as the Awesome BFRO.
They are awesome.
And I checked there to see if I could find some recent sightings, and I have to say, I wasn't disappointed. On July 12, 2008, a woman and her husband were camping in the Coconino area of the Rim. She described their campsite as pretty remote and isolated, plus it was raining, so they didn't see any other people. It was mid-afternoon, and she was reading in the front seat of their conversion van as her husband napped when she became aware of what sounded like an animal ripping bark off a tree. This noise went on for quite a while, at least 15 minutes, and thinking it was an elk, she grabbed her camera to try and snap a picture of it. She waited for about 10 minutes, but the noise had already stopped and she didn't see anything, so she put the camera down and went back to her book. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she sees this 4-foot-long branch, which she said was 3 or 4 inches thick in diameter, hurling through the air. It struck the side mirror of the van so hard that it shattered the glass and forced the mirror into the van so hard that it left a dent.
Jeez.
This poor woman jumped out of the seat and ran towards her husband, who had woken up and was wondering what had just hit their van. Now, it probably goes without saying, but that night she didn't sleep very well. And at one point, she woke up to the sound of a very large animal snuffling and sniffing around the open slider window that was near her feet. She said it sounded very large, and it huffed almost like a horse does when it exhales. She kept trying to poke her husband to get him to wake up, but she also was afraid to move because she didn't want whatever it was outside the van to know that she was awake. After about 5 minutes, the deep sniffling just stopped. She said she didn't hear the thing move away. It just went silent. The following morning, the couple discovered that their eating area had some items missing, but they were some very strange items. For instance, just one package of biscuits wrapped in aluminum foil were missing, but not the foil itself. It was as if something had carefully opened up the package and even more carefully removed every single biscuit. There wasn't a single piece, not even a crumb left behind.
Well, that's weird.
Yeah, how does a Bigfoot do such delicate, precise things with those big fingers?
I know. Not just big feet, big fingers. I don't know. That's really strange.
It is. They did happen to find a box of Jimmy Dean sausage that had been taken out of the trash, but that too was treated very carefully by whoever stole it. Well, at least Bigfoot's got some good taste, because Jimmy Dean sausage is pretty goddamn good.
I know. And you would think if it was a bear or a raccoon or something like that, you'd at least find teeth marks in the cardboard. You know, like if they were dragging it around out of the trash, you would find some sort of teeth marks or something in it.
I just feel bad for Bigfoot, because really, once they're cooked up, they're much better than eating them raw.
Or licking the inside of the box.
Perhaps so. The couple went home and then returned to the exact same spot the following weekend. They were hoping to find an answer to what kind of animal it had been. Although they didn't really have anything else happen to them, they did note one pretty strange thing. Again, it was in the afternoon, and people at another campsite up the road were shooting their guns. The woman assumed that they were just target practicing. But after each gunshot from even further away, the couple both heard a horribly eerie cross between a howl and a scream. They said it sounded nothing like any animal that they had ever heard before, and they were both lifelong Arizona residents. Now, the investigator from the BFRO who looked into the case noted in his report that when he went out to the campsite and actually found bits of glass from their van mirror, it was exactly where the woman said it happened. So that certainly does give a little bit of credibility to their story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another more recent encounter happened in Coconino National Forest, near the town of Strawberry in June of 2016. The person camping was at the U.S. Forest Service campground in a canyon surrounded by spruce, fir, oak, aspen, and ponderosa pine trees. They were sitting in the shade reading a book when they happened to glance up and see what they initially thought was a kid on a bike zooming across the gravel road. But as he watched, the person realized that it was actually a very large, very dark, very tall bipedal creature that was running very fast. It ran sort of hunched over, but its head didn't bob or move like a human's would at that speed. Once the creature was out of sight, the person walked over to where it had gone, and he discovered that there were deep impressions in the grass, which he assumed was left behind by the creature's feet. When the investigator of the BFRO went out to the site 9 days later, the impressions were still visible. He was unable to determine the actual size of the footprints, but he did note that they denoted a stride much longer than a human's.
You know, it's interesting. In both of those stories, and maybe you picked them on purpose, I don't know, both people were reading right before their Bigfoot encounter. So, you know how, like, when I'm reading and...
Yeah, you don't seem to notice anything else?
Oh, wow. Jeez, you didn't even let me set that one up.
Well, I think it's a given. You know, your head's buried in your book and you really don't notice what's going on around you.
I did last night when I was trying to read the textbook that I needed to read, and you kept interrupting me to tell me you had nothing to do when you were bored. Heh. Touché.
So what you're trying to say is perhaps Bigfoot chose the best moment to try to run past these people so they wouldn't notice.
No,
Is that what you're getting at?
That's a really good way to look at it. You may have rationalized me there. I was going to say that people that read books tend to attract Bigfoot. So if you want to see a Bigfoot, which I know you do, you just have to keep me around and make sure I'm reading.
Is that just for me or is that for everybody? Should, like, you know...
Well, it's just something
everybody
I noticed.
take their spouse out into the forest and...
Put him out as bait with a book.
Right. Sit him on a rock. Give him a book.
Right.
Maybe some Jimmy Dean sausage.
Yeah.
There you go. So maybe we found a way to attract Bigfoot.
Maybe.
Continuing on with my story, It's interesting that where people claim to encounter Bigfoot, that there are also reports of UFO sightings. The Mogollon Rim is no exception and just happens to be where one of the most famous of all UFO encounters took place, the abduction of Travis Walton.
That was there?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Well, now you do.
Yep. You're right.
In November of 1975, Walton and 6 other forestry employees working along the rim drove from the town of Heber to Turkey Springs Point. Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, spent the day with his crew, cutting down trees and piling them up for a controlled burn. When it got dark, the 7 men got back into 28-year-old crew leader Mike Rogers' truck and headed along Forest Road 300, otherwise known as Rim Road. According to WMICentral.com, they were just driving along when all of a sudden they spotted a bright light ahead illuminating the trees. At first, they thought it was a plane about to crash, but as they got closer, they realized it most definitely wasn't. About 90 feet above their heads was a huge gold disc. One of the men, 21-year-old Alan Dulles, shouted, "My God, it's a flying saucer." Rogers stopped the truck and the men peered up at it, completely in awe. Walton wanted a better look, though, so he left the safety of the truck and walked closer to the craft, which was still hovering in the sky. As he got closer to the craft, it started to descend, and suddenly fearful, he ran back towards the truck. Except before he could reach it, the craft began making a loud mechanical noise, and the whole thing wobbled back and forth. The noise from the craft was so loud that he could feel it vibrating through his entire body. As his coworkers watched, a blue beam shot down from the craft, enveloping Walton. He said later, quote, "From the instant I felt that paralyzing blow, I did not see, hear, or feel anything more." Walton was knocked to the ground, and fearing for their lives and utterly terrified, Rogers shoved the truck in gear and took off. Convinced that the UFO was following them, they made it up part of the dirt road until the craft appeared to be about 200 yards behind them. Then it rose vertically at an incredible speed and just took off. As the men calmed themselves and each other down, they realized that they needed to go back and see if Walton was okay. Now, driving in the pitch dark, Rogers returned to where the men agreed Walton had been struck down by the blue light. Except Walton wasn't there. Grabbing flashlights, the men searched the area in vain, calling for him. Strangely, there was no sign of struggle. In fact, there was no sign that anyone had been there at all, including Walton himself. Thinking that he must have made his way back to the main road, the men decided to make their way back to Heber. One of the crew, Ken Peterson, called the Navajo County Sheriff's Office immediately and spoke to a deputy, explaining the crazy thing that had just happened to them. The sheriff and the other officer, although skeptical, agreed to take Rogers, Dulles, and Peterson back to the Rim Road and help them look for their lost coworker. They found absolutely nothing, and now suspicious of their story, the police wondered if the men had murdered Walton and then concocted a wild story to cover it up.
That's quite the cover story.
Over the next 4 days, the Forest Service and law enforcement sent out trackers, men on horseback, helicopters, and search planes to try and locate Walton's body. They didn't find a single piece of evidence. No scraps of clothing, no blood, nothing that would imply a murder had taken place. All they did find was super high levels of radiation around the exact spot where the men claimed Walton had disappeared. The mystery of what happened to Travis Walton only deepened when all 6 men volunteered to take lie detector tests, and all 6 of them passed. For 5 days, Travis's wife, who was living in Snowflake, a town just outside the Rim, wondered what had happened to her young husband. In fact, lots of people wondered what happened to him. And then, on November 10th, the phone rang. Walton's brother-in-law answered it and was shocked to hear Walton's voice on the other end. He was in Heber at a payphone, and could someone come pick him up? For almost 50 years now, people have talked about and analyzed Walton's story of what exactly happened to him that night. He said he woke up on the side of the highway about a half-mile west of Heber. As he opened up his eyes and looked up, he caught the gleam of a curved, smooth surface rising into the air, illuminated by lights. Suddenly, the lights shut off and he was alone in the dark. Terrified, wondering how he had gotten there, Walton ran towards Heber to the nearest payphone and called his sister. A little after midnight, his brother and brother-in-law picked him up. All Walton knew at that point was that he was incredibly hungry, very dehydrated, and 10 pounds lighter than he had been just 5 days before.
It's a crazy story.
Well, that it is, because to lose 10 pounds in 5 days?
It's a lot.
That is a lot. The media whipped themselves into a frenzy when they heard Walton was found safe. The Walton family began receiving alarming phone calls warning them not to let Walton out of their sight, because if they did, he might disappear again. And that was implying that the government agencies might be interested in silencing him. But silencing him from what? Nobody would say.
Right, because it was, like a Men in Black kind of situation.
Exactly. In an attempt to get away from all of this craziness, Walton's brother drove him to Phoenix. Once they were in Phoenix, they contacted the Ground Saucer Watch, a UFO group made up of scientists, engineers, and professionals. The GSW talked to people who claimed to have had UFO encounters and applied scientific inquiry to each case. They also made it their mission to educate the media with factual data as well as pursuing legal actions against the federal government when they felt people's rights and voices were being jeopardized and silenced. Now, I'm assuming that Walton's brother contacted the group because of the weird phone calls his family had been getting. But anyway, while they were in Phoenix, Walton also went to both a physician and a psychiatrist. It was while he was under hypnosis that Walton began to remember just what had happened to him during the missing time that made up those 5 days. Now, if any of you have seen the 1993 movie Fire in the Sky, or read either of Travis Walton's books, The Walton Experience and Fire in the Sky, then you know that what he claimed happened to him was pretty frightening.
Did you ever see that movie?
Yes, I did.
It scared the crap out of me. Like, I found it incredibly frightening.
Did you really?
Yeah, and it stuck with me for months. Like, I would think about it for months. I found it really scary.
Well, I found it definitely intriguing. That's for sure. I mean, it was eerie.
Yeah, I think it was psychologically frightening.
Yeah.
You know?
But, I was a little bit older than you at that time, so.
Yeah, I think I was like a freshman or a sophomore in college.
Right.
Yeah.
So, while under hypnosis, Walton claimed that when he regained consciousness after being struck by the UFO's beam of light, he found himself inside a hospital-like room inside some sort of craft. Circling him were 3 very short, bald-headed creatures who didn't speak to him, but who seemed to be very interested in him. They put a mask over his face and he blacked out until he woke up on the highway. Walton passed several polygraph tests and a voice stress test after his hypnosis that confirmed he was telling the truth. The psychiatrist confirmed that Walton was mentally sound. Now, Walton's story has been controversial since the day he first told it. People seem to be equally divided into those who believe his encounter happened and those who say he made it all up. Now, the detractors are harsh, even going as far as saying that he was a drug addict who was only describing a hallucination that turned into a 50-year-old hoax. Believers say that that's exactly what detractors would claim if they wanted to discredit him. Walton himself, though, has basically said that the entire experience was utterly terrifying, but that the hell detractors have put him through has been even worse.
Jeez.
Well, I mean, he did go through a lot after that.
Yeah, I mean, his experience was 5 days of lost time, and the detractors have been giving him shit for 50 years.
Yeah. And I tend to believe him.
Me too.
Regardless of what side you may be on, Walton's story certainly got people talking about UFOs and alien abductions, sparking a conversation that has become more mainstream as the decades have passed.
That's true. That's the first big UFO story I ever heard about. Abduction story.
Right.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I've heard them speak many, many times on podcasts, and they don't change their stories.
No.
Either they rehearse this really, really well, which I absolutely don't believe, or it happened, which I believe did happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's amazing.
It's terrifying, frankly. Yeah.
So, if you're into gorgeous scenic places, the Mogollon Rim is the perfect place for you to get outdoors and experience some pretty breathtaking wonders. And if you also happen to be into the paranormal, then it's just the icing on top of the cake.
Unless you're afraid of being abducted, then don't go there.
Well, I think the thing that I've came to the conclusion is that you take your loved one, put them out on a rock with a book.
Make sure they have a book. Nice.
Get into a safe spot some distance away, get your camera out, and just wait for it to happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a loving thought, honey.
It is. Well, you know, next time we're at the Grand Canyon, now we know what to do. Bring one of your books on a walk with you.
Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? There's not a lot of spots where you can just sit and read a book. To get down in there, you have to get on a donkey or a horse, and then it takes a really long time for the donkey or the horse to get you all the way down into the bottom of the canyon. I don't even know if you can camp down there anymore. I camped up at the top, I think, or I just stopped. I think I looked at it and said, wow, that's a really big hole. And then we kept going. Not to, downplay or say anything bad about the Grand Canyon. I just wasn't all that impressed by the Grand Canyon. Frankly. You have such a twisted mind. Medieval torture devices.
Well,
leaving your wife out as bait for a Bigfoot.
What did people do back then? They watched train wrecks.
Well, that's true. They did. It was a pastime to go watch trains.
Public hangings.
Right.
Whippings.
Right.
So, giving you a book, sitting you out on a rock in the middle of the Grand Canyon, well, that seems pretty tame.
I was going to say, that's tame compared to the other options.
All right. I'm rather tired. You've beat me down.
Okay. Well, as of out... Oh, jeez. Now you look what you did to me. I can't talk anymore.
Oh, that's my fault.
As always, if you would like to know more, you can always check the sources in our show notes. Like I said earlier, there were hundreds of years of history of Malahide Castle that I did not cover. That is very fascinating, but not necessarily ghost-related. And I'm sure there's a lot more about Mogollon Rim. There's got to be.
Of course there is.
I mean, the BFRO database is fascinating. You could probably find 20 or 30 different Bigfoot sightings in the area.
Yeah, and like we said, if you're into Bigfoot, check it out. You never know what sightings are going on around you.
Yeah. I think I've said before, it's organized by state and then by county, and then it goes in chronological order. And you just click till you get to where you want to go. It's pretty cool.
Well, with that said, that about wraps it up for this episode.
Yes.
Join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.